Hi, this is Scott Miller. Welcome to my Top Performance blog. I have the honor and pleasure of speaking today with a person that is a colleague, a fellow psychologist, and I would like to consider him a friend as well. He's certainly been a mentor to me and to our team as we've pursued research on the subject of deliberate practice. Dr. Ericsson, hello.
Hi, Scott. I certainly hope that at least I'm considering you my friend, so hopefully here it's mutual. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to talking because I think my interactions with you have been, really exciting because I think it's all about if there are some useful ideas, there has to be ways here in which they can be applied and really make a difference.
Well, and you know the history very well. We reached out to you after having struggled to understand how to account for the superior performance in terms of outcome of some psychotherapists versus others. And these therapists were just a little more effective. They were a lot more effective and consistently so. Many attempts had been made to explain this in terms of personality and history and particular methods and models. And then I gave up. I thought, well, this just must be some chance event here. Some people are born this way. Seriously, we watched their videos. I couldn't make heads nor tails of it. And then I was in a middle seat coming home, I believe from Scandinavia, and I was bored and I reached into the pocket in front of me and there was a magazine called Fortune magazine. And in there, an article that was written by Jeff Colvin, who was the editor, and it was about your work, about deliberate practice. It was that moment I thought, this may be the answer. And the first part I'm a bit embarrassed to admit is that you had been laboring away in the vineyard, so to speak, for 40 years nearly by that time. And I, as a clinical psychologist, had never heard anything about it.
Well, I like to be in the vineyard looking for new things. So it's, hopefully here there will be some more vintages that I can deliver here before it's my time here to stop.
Well, I hope that isn't anytime soon. I'll tell you, you're routinely referred to as the expert on expertise and had written a great deal, had conducted numerous studies, had colleagues that you'd worked with to study the development of expertise. And if I sort of let the cat out of the bag, it all boiled down to a simple phrase that prior to 2007 had never ever been used in the field of psychotherapy, and that is deliberate practice. And those two words, deliberate, done intentionally, and practice, over and over, repetition and trying to improve, really captures what the research in the field of psychotherapy is beginning to suggest accounts for superior performance. But here's my question to start off with. Where did this idea come from for you? How did you develop the idea of deliberate practice?
Well, like most things in life, it's a complex story, but I think I've always been interested in my own thinking, and in particular, maybe even more interested in finding ways to understand how people who I really am impressed by, how they're thinking. But essentially that starting point that there are things going on when people are facing complex situations that really set apart those people who are successful in dealing with these situations and those people who are not. So I guess there's a path, and I think maybe the most important stepping stone here in my career was when a Nobel Prize winner, Herbert Simon, invited me to go to spend 2 years with him in the States. I was basically living in Sweden and, grown up in Sweden. And during those couple of years, I started working with a colleague of him on we were interested in how modifiable people would be. And at that time, the idea here that people had a limited working memory seemed to be something that people relied on a lot to explain why some people seem to be able to think in a much more effective way than others.
Mm.
So we started just looking at this test that is used now to measure your short-term memory capacity, and recruited a student who was basically just taking that test over and over, and it's random numbers, so we could, make sure here every time it was unique sequence. And I guess my interest was, after each trial, asking him what actually happened in your head when you were doing this.
Mm.
And what was interesting and surprising to everyone, including me, was that after about 200 hours, this guy could reproduce sequences of over 80 random numbers.
Wow.
But what was more interesting was that the verbal reports really showed here how qualitatively different he was actually doing the task, that really allowed him now to go from kind of the normal range of a telephone number with 7 digits to now being able to reproduce over 80 digits.
80, amazing. And before that, there must have been some world record for digits or something.
I think the highest number that I was able to find was, I guess, in around 20.
20. So here's a person that after 200 hours is up to 80 digits. And you're asking him to share his thoughts with you.
And I think that's a big difference, that, a lot of people who wanted to understand how experts would do, like a chess player, or if you're a soccer player, a reporter would say, so how did you figure out why you did this? Or basically, what is it that you're doing differently? And they will tell you stuff. But I think there was very little progress. So what we ended up doing now was to actually have somebody do something, and then actually get immediately afterwards a record of what actually went on.
Mm.
And I think maybe the thing that was the most compelling to people was that we could design experiments. So by slightly changing now the procedure with the digits, when we presented him with consonants, he wouldn't be able to do the encodings that he did with the random numbers.
Oh, that's interesting.
So at 80 digits, he was still like at 6 or 7 consonants.
Huh.
Suggesting here that there is a mechanism that has to be built that can kind of explain now for your superior performance. And I think the world record now, I think, is about 600 random numbers that people can reproduce. And we've actually argued that our subjects had to discover this on the spot. They got feedback about what they made mistakes on, but basically they had to generate it. Those people who do about 600 random numbers, they draw on this knowledge that people have developed on how you best build a skill for memorizing numbers or cards or whatever it is. So that's sort of a little bit like the difference here between, working with a tennis coach who can actually help you now become a very good tennis player, versus play with your sister or brother and then try to just get better.
There's a shortcut once you're working with that particular expert that knows what you need to practice.
Right. They've seen paths that other people have taken. And I think that's what the most compelling thing is, that when you encounter an expert who can point now to 20 music students that basically have been very successful, I think that's a very compelling proof that if I am motivated and want to work with this teacher, that I'm likely to be as successful myself.
And so I'm thinking of the story of your person who is able to, in time, 200 hours, assemble 80 digits when the world record had been 20 or 14, whatever it might have been. And what the person with no knowledge about deliberate practice might think, that, well, the way to do this is to simply get better at repeating these things in your head. So 1, 8, 10, 17, 24, 28, 10, and repeating. But you discovered something else happened. Something happened in the process.
Yeah, so basically this idea that you're just kind of doing what is the most automatic reaction, like rehearsing the numbers. If you keep doing that, you may be improving a couple of digits. We've done that experiment several times in our lab. But the key thing was for him to actually group the numbers into, say, 3 digits, and then trying to give them meaning. And given that he was a runner, one of the things that automatically occurred to him was to think of them as running times. So basically 4, 2, 3 could be 4 minutes and 23 seconds for a very, respectable mile time.
So somehow or other, he, using his natural knowledge and skills, or skills and knowledge that he had, he begins chunking this information into larger bits. And then this facilitates.
Right. Although I think one thing is that it's not like you actually are storing these independent patterns like chunks. And we did a lot of experiments showing that it's much more complex. So it's kind of a more active encoding. So basically the encoding as a mile time that is pretty good, that's going to be a range. So it's probably going to be a 4-digit that starts it out. But then he's actually now forming associations between that 4 and the remaining digits that is sort of like an experience thing. So if you were to ask him, a month later, he wouldn't have a clue about this. But basically it's there, so he would be able then to retrieve it during the time of recall that sequence.
And so I'm thinking of a parallel in the world of psychotherapy, because one of the first questions you asked me was, well, what are the skills that people have to learn? And I said, well, that's an interesting part about our field, because there are hosts of claims about skills, but none of them seem to lead uniquely to better outcomes. And so exploring what it meant to deliberately practice in psychotherapy has taken us, I think, some time to really wrap our heads around it. But what's happening right now in the field is that traditional models of therapy, which include a series of techniques and strategies, people are simply being encouraged to repeat those over and over and over again. And it seems as though people come to master the models, but the outcomes aren't necessarily improving as a result.
And I think that's one of the interesting things about that memory paradigm that I wasn't really aware of, because in order to measure the limits of anyone's performance, you actually go up to a length where they're starting to make mistakes. And I think that was sort of a driver to keep improving, because he would, on all sessions, pretty much have sequences that were so long that he made a mistake on them. But it's also pushing you beyond sort of the things that you already can do.
Right. So I'm thinking of an example that you use in your book, Peak, about driving. And I've been driving since I was 16. I haven't had an accident in 20 years. I'd like to think that I'm getting better and better at it, obviously. But what your story in the book shows nicely is that simply because you've been driving without accidents for a number of years doesn't mean that you're improving, actually. Is this fitting with what you have to actually, if I wanted to improve, I'd have to find out where my usual driving begins to break down, under what context, circumstances, and conditions.
Right. And I actually remember seeing one of these idioms about you will not find a very skilled sailor who has always been sailing on still waters or something. That general idea that the way you get better is actually trying to do things that you can't already do. And I think one of the challenges applying this is to give you accurate feedback. So how would one be able now to kind of know what the correct would be? We find, for example, I have a student who did a little project trying to train his concentration. So he actually listened to webcasts and then immediately try to recall everything else. And then he could compare his recall to basically the webcast as a way here of now tracking his ability to sustain concentration.
So the discrepancy between the record and the that you've kept and the recall of that record. And in psychotherapy, I think that one key aspect of this has been to help therapists create a measured baseline of their performance in terms of effectiveness and engagement of the client. If we are able to measure their performance, we might be able, and we have been able, to identify where and with whom, under what circumstances, their performance begins to fall short.
Just that sort of thing that I've come to appreciate is that when you make a mistake, very often, you get feedback. But the real question is, how can you now look back on what you were thinking about? So next time you have sort of a richer representation that will actually pretty much eliminate you making that same mistake, as opposed to this idea, okay, next time I won't do this. But the key thing is, how would you actually now anticipate when you're getting close to a situation where maybe that sometimes very rapid reaction may be so fast that you really can't, inhibit it.
And so a richer representation, and somehow this fits with a person's deliberate practice efforts. They're having more choices, including knowing that they're coming up to that point where they might make the error that they've made in the past, and then being able to see or think through. Help me understand that. How does that fit with the deliberate practice piece?
One area where they've done a lot of research is chess. And it's hard to study chess because a chess game may take 2 or 3 hours. But what they have been able to do is actually find that you can find challenging chess positions that you can give to everyone the same positions. And you can find now that the ability of selecting the best move for these positions, that's actually very highly correlated now with your tournament rating. So something that might take about 200 hours to measure by your tournament results, you can actually now measure in 15 minutes and get a pretty good predictor. And that actually ends up the kind of activity that chess players rely on.
Interesting. And I'm thinking of a parallel here with some research that my colleague, who you know, Daryl Chow, has been doing. We're in the process of writing up 3 randomized trials where we put therapists into a difficult conversation moment in therapy. And we have ideas about the methods, the ways that working through that difficult scenario leads to a better outcome. And then we have the person respond and provide feedback about what they could have done that, I think I'm understanding this now, provides them with more choices, a more complex representation of the field than the one that they had before the trial.
Yeah, and I would point maybe also to a soccer player or a basketball player who actually suddenly gets the ball. And you can actually study that by showing videos. And now the task, you can blank out the screen and say, what should you or this person who has the ball now do? And what you find is that the best basketball players, they're more likely to be aware of the relative comings and goings of players, so they can actually now pass it in a way that increases the probability here that your team will score than somebody who's less skilled, who has a much more limited view of what happens and what they could be doing. It's almost like you can see into the future, and because you're so skilled, and we can actually prove that you are able to see sort of in the future, because you can make predictions that we can actually show are correct.
And help me draw the distinction between traditional education and deliberate practice in this mode, because I suppose that why don't we just show all soccer players how to do it the right way and then expect that they would do it? So what's the difference between that traditional education, here's the right way to add 2 + 2, and now go do it? What help me see the difference.
Well, I've always had difficulty a little bit with K through 12 and even college education, because nobody's telling me what is a gold standard by which we actually know whether a student actually has, met all the expectations that we had for him, or compare one university to another university and their ability to produce. But once you start looking at professional schools like medicine, engineering, even actually teaching children, because there we can actually measure how well the children are doing at the beginning of the semester and at the end of the semester, and you find that some teachers are able to bring their children to a higher level than their colleagues.
Yeah. And so this idea of just showing people how to do it, that's clearly not sufficient.
And I think it boils down to that you have to have an idea here of how you can actually measure the performance that you're trying to produce.
Mm.
Now, if you want to basically get people to be good at answering multiple choice questions, then maybe our university system is good. But life is rarely, in the form of a multiple choice question where that only one answer is correct.
So I'm beginning to hear the elements of this entire deliberate practice piece. One is you have to have a baseline. The second thing is there has to be, you have to be shown or be invited to look at your errors when your performance begins to break down. Somebody then has to illustrate a different way to do it, or there has to be an illustration. Then there has to be a coach or somebody involved that teaches you to approximate that better performance and continues to give you feedback. Am I getting this picture right?
Right.
Okay.
And by basically forcing now the teacher to be able to prove that their students have been actually successful at getting to this skill. Mm-hmm. And that I'm surprised to find that it's very hard to get, say, golf coaches to commit to that model, because they've told me that the people who are paying for golf they're really not that interested in pushing themselves to get better. They're kind of more interested in finding their inner golf self. So when they're playing, they're actually, actualizing their own golf playing behavior. Huh. And that turns out to be a lot easier to get people to, be able to play the way they normally play, as opposed to really change their behavior. Now, obviously, there's some golfers who really want to get better. But that's one reason why golf coaches at least told me that they don't want to keep track, because they have so many golfers that never really gets any better.
So I want to make sure I understand this last part. Are you saying that a person who says, geez, I'd like to learn how to play better golf, they hire a golf pro, but perhaps what they're more interested in is feeling good about themselves, which deliberate practice, at least at the beginning, is not going to make you feel good about yourself, it doesn't seem.
Right, and it's sort of a delayed reaction. I think once you see when you got substantially better, that may be a really interesting feeling. And also, I think, a lot of people actually get more attuned to themselves and their feelings, because when they're confronted here with themselves against the task, where they have the teacher occasionally coming in and helping them with things that they can't figure out for themselves, that's a sort of a pretty rich life.
Yeah.
I think in these days here, where people are limited here as to how much travel they can do, they can maybe start traveling inside of themselves.
Okay. It's such a perplexing question to me. How can we help people move from wanting to feel good about themselves to this wanting to actually be better at what they do?
Well, I think when I talk to doctors, I find a lot of the doctors who in some sense can't really see the difference that they made to their patients' lives. And that is a real driving force for them to follow up, so they can maybe, if they get a similar case later on, do something. And I assume that you probably already have tapes, because that's one of the problems in a lot of professions, is that you don't really make it public what you're doing. So you really are in some ways protecting yourself in terms of feedback. So the really experts that I know, they have to almost self-generate these efforts to get feedback.
So they're going that extra step. Interesting. And I think I have already got, you've already given one answer about the 2 or 3 big mistakes that people could make if they're approaching the subject of deliberate practice for that person who's approaching deliberate practice for the first time?
I think one thing, but that's sort of linked a little bit with the teacher, that if you look at in sports and people who want to start running marathons, you know, they don't really have a good sense here of what is the appropriate training intensity. So some of them, you know, work really hard for the first week and then they can't continue. Because if you over push too hard, you're likely to injure yourself as an athlete and burn out. You can do in pretty much any type of activity. I think when I talk to people who are very successful, it's almost like they have this daily routine. So they don't really have to ask themselves, do I feel like doing this today? No, they just start doing it. And once they start doing it, they're so involved in it. And then they get to a point where they feel like they can't focus sufficiently to really work on these things that they can't yet do. Well, then you stop. And that point, typically when people look back, you know, they have a good feeling, you know, they've done something. They're actually a little bit different than they were yesterday.
Anders, I really appreciate you spending the time with me today to talk about the work that you've been doing. And let me say once again how much of an inspiration you've been, and we have appreciated and continue to appreciate your mentorship.
Well, I would love to be in touch, and you know, anytime you think I can be helpful, I'm just an email away.
Thank you.
And thank you.